Hi, I'm Marc, and on this channel I talk about Brexit and UK politics. London wants to remain Europe's most important financial centre and is fighting for its influence in Brussels. The time for provocations would be over, promises at least City of London boss Chris Hayward. Chris Hayward came to Brussels to give a sign of life. At the annual perception at the Natural History Museum on Tuesday evening, the chief lobbyist for the City of London Corporation invoked the shared interests of the financial industry on both sides of the English Channel. His message is that London is open for discussions and business. Since the Brexit vote 7 years ago, the financial centre has been fighting to defend its top position in Europe. Banks, insurers and investment companies have opened new offices in the EU and thousands of employees have moved. Trade flows have shifted since financial firms are no longer allowed to sell services from London to the EU. And Hayward says in an interview with the German newspaper Handelsblatt that a lot of trust has been destroyed. The whole Brexit process was a difficult time for the city, he says. We were completely ignored, he says. The financial sector was left out of the free trade agreement between the EU and Great Britain, and later the dispute over the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol led to an ice age that lasted for years. All contact with the EU was broken off in this case, and that only changed when the two partners found a solution for Northern Ireland and the trade there with the Windsor Agreement in February. Now the financial industry senses the opportunity for a new beginning. The time for British politicians to provoke Brussels would be over, assures Hayward, and he says Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Chancellor of the Exchequer Jeremy Hunt view the EU positively. And it could get even better. According to the polls, the traditionally EU-friendly Labour Party will win the next general election by a landslide. And the first meeting of the new regulatory forum took place last week. The bilateral working group between the EU Commission and the British Ministry of Finance wants to meet twice a year to discuss financial regulation. And the first meeting was more of a nice to see you, says Hayward. Specific projects have not been discussed there. The goal is to prevent fragmentation, says Hayward. We want to make sure we align our rules wherever we can. This is good for financial services providers in the UK and EU. Yeah, the Tories should listen to him there. These are the new tones after the British government has long highlighted the advantages of its own set of rules. There are hardly any examples of how London is using these new freedom after Brexit. The first visible departure from EU rules came this week when regulators PRA and FCA announced they would scrap caps on bankers' bonuses. You might have seen my video on that. The EU introduced this after the financial crisis in order to reduce risk incentives for bankers. And Hayward explains that it is about increasing competitiveness with other global financial centers. New York also has no problem with a stronger risk culture. However, he does not want to see this as a signal of turning away from the EU. They want to coordinate closely with Brussels on other topics such as green finance, digitalization, and artificial intelligence. Other industry representatives do not believe that abolishing the bonus cap will give London a decisive competitive advantage, though. The generous tax regulations for foreign bankers in France or Italy would be worth much more. That was said by Nicolas Mackel, managing director of Luxembourg for finance. And Mackel emphasizes that he is not at all jealous of the financial center of London. They've been trying to figure out what they can do with their so-called freedom for 7 years, and they realize that they can do next to nothing with it, he says. London has closed the doors to its largest market and now wants to sell its financial products to countries like China and India, and these markets are closed. In his view, Britain has no choice but to limit the damage and, over time, deepen its ties with the EU again. The British supervisory authorities would ensure that the government does not deviate too far from EU rules, says Marc. They haven't forgotten the financial crisis yet. In fact, Hayward already has an urgent matter in Brussels. He says, "We would like to talk about clearing. This is a key area that France wants to take over." Yes, they do. Clearing houses are a central part of the financial infrastructure. As intermediaries between buyers and sellers, they process every transaction. And so far, London companies like LCH have dominated the business. But the aim of the EU Commission is to reduce dependence on LCH and Co. EU companies will be allowed to conduct their business via London until the end of 2025, when the transition period should end finally. And Hayward is now pushing for the London clearing houses to be permanently recognized. European companies would benefit from this just as much as British companies, he says. Well, EU Finance Commissioner Merit McGuinness has so far rejected this, and definitely a different point of view. She sees this as a systemic risk for the EU, and I agree. McGuinness regularly makes it clear in her discussions with London that Britain cannot expect special treatment. And that is a very clear message, confirms Hayward. You are out of the internal market and you cannot come back in through the back door, is the message. London will still try, and the chances are not bad for a little bit, because, as Merkel also admits, London is still the most important financial center in Europe. When it comes to clearing in particular, the dependency is so great that the EU could ultimately have no choice but to recognize the status quo. His words, not mine, because I don't think so. And Hayward avoids the question of the most important rival in the EU. London is in competition with financial centers around the world, he says. In any case, the relocation of jobs to the EU is not nearly as bad as we originally thought, he says. This is due, among other things, to the fact that EU companies now also have to open or expand offices in London. And Hayward also does not want to answer the question of whether the financial center will be better or worse off after Brexit. I would not have voted for Brexit because the single market offers unique opportunities, he says, so avoiding the question. But we are out now and we shouldn't talk about the past. We need to talk about how we can compete globally. Distraction. The EU Commission is increasing pressure on financial firms to relocate their clearing operations to the EU, as I said, and critics say the reform does not even go far enough. And the UK financial industry lost access to the EU after Brexit because the UK is no longer a member of the European single market. The single market is a system that allows goods, services, capital, and people to move freely between EU member states without barriers. Under the single market, financial services firms based in one EU member state can passport their services into other member states without having to obtain separate licenses or approvals. When the UK left the EU, it also left the single market, and this means that UK-based financial firms can no longer passport their services into the EU. Instead, they must obtain individual licenses or approvals from each EU member state in which they want to operate. And that process is costly and time-consuming, and it has made it more difficult for UK-based financial firms to do business in the EU. In addition, the EU has introduced some new regulations for financial services firms that are based outside the EU. These regulations are designed to protect EU consumers and investors, and they can add to the costs and complexity of doing business in the EU for UK-based firms. As a result of these changes, some UK-based financial firms have relocated some or all of their EU operations to member states within the single market. And other firms have scaled back their operation in the EU because of it. As mentioned before, UK-based financial firms can no longer passport their services into the EU. And this has made it more difficult and expensive for them to do business in the EU at all. And as I said, those new regulations for financial services firms from outside the EU are not helping there either. And they also add to the cost and complexity, time-consuming, whatever you want. And some EU member states have imposed restrictions on the ability of UK-based financial firms to operate in their markets. And this has made it more difficult for UK-based firms to serve EU clients and customers. Overall, Brexit has had a significant impact on the UK financial industry's access to the EU. The loss of passporting rights, the increased regulatory burden, and the reduced access to EU markets have made it more difficult and expensive for UK-based financial firms to do their business in the EU. And there are still transitional periods in place. We have not reached the end of it. And so when always people say Brexit is done, it's not done by far. You will see the full effect of Brexit when all those transitional periods are over. And if you want to see something else right now, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.